8:40 here. So Mickey Kaus and Robert Wright just released a new 1 hour and 47 minute show. And during the conversation, which I found incredibly annoying because just as Mickey Kaus is getting started into a great point, Robert Wright is constantly tripping him up and interrupting him. Robert Wright is just an incredibly obnoxious host. He's just so full of himself that he feels absolutely entitled to interrupt other people. And most people, such as myself, we have an ingrained deference to certain civility duties that we are highly reluctant to interrupt people the way that Robert Wright does. So Mickey Kaus was making an interesting point about Kamala Harris's annoying head nod, that she'll make an incredibly inane point and then nod her head as though you need to agree with her, essentially because she's the diversity, equity, and inclusion candidate, and so you have no choice but to agree with whatever pablum she spews publicly. Then Robert Wright did come back with a good rejoinder that annoying tics are those tics exhibited by the people you really can't stand. And Mickey Kaus was praising Mark Halperin's show, he says, to which he's become addicted, as have I. And Mickey used to quote Mark Halperin approvingly 20 years ago. So Mickey's a long-time Mark Halperin respecter. And Robert Wright dissed Mark Halperin for one prediction that Halperin got wrong, that Halperin predicted that there'd be some sort of open primary for the Democrats once Joe Biden decided not to run again. And what Halperin usually does is that he shares with viewers what he's hearing, right? So what Halperin shared was what he was hearing from his sources. And Robert Wright, who's more on the left than Mickey Kaus, said that he finds Ezra Klein much more impressive. And I don't, right? I find about 1 out of 20 Ezra Klein podcasts useful. And I find about 80% of Mark Halperin shows useful. So on Mark Halperin's show today, there was a caller from the United Kingdom who made a great point, which I think I've also made, but not in this succinct and powerful way that this bloke made it. That is, there is one person in the world who can guarantee a Donald Trump victory in November. Right, so who is that? Who is the one person in the world who can guarantee a Donald Trump victory in November? It is Bibi Netanyahu. So I've made the point that Bibi Netanyahu has been escalating, that he has exhibited much less deference to the White House over the past 2 months, steadily less and less deference, right? Recognizing that Joe Biden's a lame duck. And now is the time politically to escalate, if you might need escalation. And this escalation can only redound to the benefit of Donald Trump, or in other words, to the detriment of Democrats who are divided between their sources of money, funding, who are Jews with varying attachments to Israel, and much of their base, which is indifferent or hostile to Israel. So the more rioting you have on college campuses this fall, right, the more that will likely redound to Donald Trump's favor, because chaos works against the party of the incumbent. Now, Republicans are completely disingenuous, and pundits are not right when they say about Kamala Harris's plans, well, why isn't she implementing them now? Because she's the vice president. She's an employee. Are you an employee? Are you able to just implement whatever plans that you want to implement as an employee? Vice presidents take orders. Now, they can adroitly exercise persuasion, which Dick Cheney did, But Dick Cheney was not the decider, right? George W. Bush was the decider. Dick Cheney was not the driving force behind America's invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11. It was George W. Bush who was the decider. So as vice president, what discretionary independent power has Kamala Harris or any vice president had to implement their agenda? What discretionary independent power did Mike Pence have to implement his agenda? None. So it looks like Israel just wants to keep escalating. And that goes against the tropes we've been hearing from the news media the past few months, how it's not in anyone's interest to have a wider war in the Middle East, that Israel risks a wider war in the Middle East, that Israel has many reasons to be cautious about stimulating a wider war in the Middle East. And I think starting about January of this year, I made the point that there are many, many reasons to believe, and many factions in Israel that do believe this, that it is in Israel's interest to initiate a wider war, to escalate. And that's exactly what Israel's doing, is paying less heed to American direction now than at any point since the October 7 attack. And at what level of degradation of Hezbollah in Lebanon would mean that this was good strategy on the part of Israel. So if Israel deteriorates Hezbollah's capacity by 50%, can we then clearly say, yeah, this was a great strategic decision by Israel? I think so. If Israel reduces Hezbollah's ability to hurt it by 50%, then this is a success. Now, on the other hand, if all of Israel's attacks have only reduced Hezbollah's offensive abilities by 5%, right, then that's another matter. But so far there has been no downside to Israel for all its escalation against Iran and Lebanon and Hezbollah and wiping out Hamas. I can't see any concrete signs of prices paid, significant downsides to Israel. So in the conventional news media and conventional punditry, there is this perspective that a peace deal is always better than a war, that a peace deal is a better guarantee of safety and prosperity in the absence of terrorism than war. And sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. There's no magic to a peace deal. A peace deal has to be aligned with people's incentives, and wars have to not proceed as you expect for them to be a bad idea. Right? You only have wars because the different parties have estimations of their own strength and the other party's strength. Right? If all parties before a conflict saw themselves in each other accurately, you'd never have war because they'd already know the outcome. But you have war because usually one side either overestimates its own abilities or underestimates their opponent's abilities. And so far, it appears like Israel has absolutely smashed Hezbollah. And it does not appear that Hezbollah has strength, the capacity, or the incentive to fight back. So Hezbollah is just getting slaughtered. Now, it was crazy after the Israel pager attack on Hezbollah last week. You had such widespread denunciation of the attack because you could not find a more targeted example of attacking terrorists. Right? Given that anything you do against terrorists in sufficient numbers, right, if you're going after, say, more than 50 terrorists, you're always going to have collateral damage. And so Israel badly injured about 2,000 Hezbollah battalion commanders, right? The only people who got Hezbollah pagers were battalion commanders. So these were all leaders of Hezbollah. And that we only have reports of 2 civilian casualties from this attack is amazing. You could not find an example of a more targeted, more ethical attack. And so if you accuse Israel of nihilism and terrorism for the most targeted attack imaginable, it does not seem to me a particularly compelling case. I mean, it means that you're a fool. You can't get more targeted than a pager attack that blows up Hezbollah battalion leaders' pagers. So if you're concerned about the ethics of war, right, this was sterling. Now, what about the strategy? Well, a strategy of wounding your opponent and weakening him is, ceteris paribus, all other things being held equal, a great strategy. Right? Wiping out the command structure for your enemy strikes me as a really good strategy. And then destroying munition dumps of Hezbollah, right? Destroying the weapons that Hezbollah is firing to try to slaughter as many Israeli citizens as possible. Right? Strikes me as really good strategy. And one example of what a great strategy is of this is that Iran's new president spoke at the United Nations and talked about Iran's wish for peace and rapprochement with the West and some kind of new JCPOA nuclear deal with the West, referring to the deal that the Barack Obama administration reached with Iran regarding Iran's nuclear program back in 2015. And so when one side is publicly saying, we want to negotiate, we don't want to fight, that's obviously a sign of weakness. You're already behind in negotiations. You're already come from a position of weakness. You have to be the one that says publicly, no mas, we want to negotiate. Just as if Donald Trump wants to negotiate an end to the Ukraine-Russia war, it's not going to do him any favors come out and say that he wants in his heart for Ukraine to win. Right, that sounds good, it feels good, it may be politically good, but it won't be effective. It won't be in the best interests of settling the Russia-Ukraine war. So what feels good and sounds good, right, often very different from what actually does good. I also find bizarre the fixation on Palestinian rights in the news media and among many elites and among pundits and foreign policy experts. Right, there's no state of Palestine, and rights in any meaningful sense only come from your nation state. Because there's no Palestinian state, Palestinians have no rights. The only way that Palestinians can achieve rights is to create their own state or to go join another state. So if Palestinians move to Jordan or Lebanon or Syria or Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, right, they can have the same rights as citizens in those low-functioning countries. So the default Western media, Western elite perspective on Palestinians is that they are having their rights denied when, lacking a nation state, they have no rights. And examples of other Arab Muslim states where they have the capacity to provide their citizens rights shows that Arab and Muslim states don't care much about providing rights to their citizens. So why would Palestinians be entitled to extraordinary rights that none of their fellow Muslims or fellow Arabs can be bothered creating for their own people in their own states? It's like the complaints about white privilege. as though whites have achieved whatever level of prosperity and harmony and high-functioning political systems only on the backs of oppressing non-whites. Why don't people complaining about white privilege point out all the sterling, advanced, affluent, safe, prosperous, filled with freedom states created by Africans? There aren't any. Why don't they point out all these prosperous free states created by Arabs and Muslims? There aren't any. People of Northern European heritage created the least corrupt states in the world. And that did not require oppression of outsiders as the primary determining factor. Whatever problems Jews have are primarily the result of problems within Jewish life. Whatever problems blacks have or gays have or Mexican Americans have are primarily the results of dysfunctions within their own communities. Let's go to the chat. John Mearsheimer has characterized Israel's war in Gaza as a genocide. Does this demonstrate? John Mearsheimer characterizes Israel's war in Gaza as a genocide. Does this demonstrate his views on the Israel lobby are partly motivated by anti-Israel bias and not just political realism? Possibly. Can I ask you a question, Luke? Sure. Am I Hispanic? No, I'm not. So I'm listening to an Audible book, a biography of Vince McMahon, the WWE founder and public sports personality. His wife, Linda McMahon, ran for U.S. Senate and lost. And it's really helpful for understanding Donald Trump because there's so much about Donald Trump's personality that is not congenial to me, right? The lying, the boasting, the outrageous claims. Right? I don't like those parts of Trump's personality, but they're very much a part of the performative world of professional wrestling, meaning the fake kind. And there was one great insight that, the matches are fixed, but the underlying insights into the human condition that are revealed by the pageantry of this fake wrestling is real. And I thought that applies to much of Donald Trump's rhetoric. So we don't have much reason to believe that Donald Trump's rhetoric about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. We don't have much reason to believe that is factually true. But is that getting at a deeper truth that there is dislocation and all sorts of horrible problems created by this massive inflow of Haitian immigrants into Springfield, Ohio, and that may well be true. And so I think the news media is right to focus on the lack of evidence for Trump and Vance claims about Haitian immigrants eating pets. But the literal truth is not the only story. Just like with wrestling, that the matches are fixed is not the only important part. It's not the only appealing part. It's not the only reason that people pay attention. Right? It is the dramas and the art, right? It's lowbrow art of professional wrestling reveals deeper truths. And so do we deride a novel? Do we deride a TV series or a movie because it's not factually true? Do we deride Hamlet and Macbeth because they're not factually true? No. Right, they are fictions that get at some eternal truths about human nature. And so too with many of Trump's claims, often on the face of it, false, but at the same time, often getting to deeper truths. And so the news is handicapped by its genre to focus on the literal level of things that politicians say, because they can hold those literal pronouncements up against the pronouncements of bureaucracy, such as law enforcement agencies or the city manager of Springfield, and make a claim whether the statement by the politician is factually true or false. But the news typically does not discuss political comments in terms of a literary genre and what are the deeper metaphorical truths that the politician might be getting at. Oh man, so I had to have a drop in a doctor's appointment the other day for something very minor, but something that I needed to just get taken care of, or it would be painful and annoying and possibly doing me permanent damage. And so I have this character flaw. When I am forced to wait, I start writing up unenforceable tickets in my mind. How dare they keep me waiting? I just get outraged. And this was a drop-in appointment. I asked, can I stop by at 4:30 to get this, in my mind, minor thing fixed? And so after an hour and a half, I was just ready to storm out of there. But I had no rational reason for believing that I'd get care any quicker than I did, because this was a drop-in. I didn't have a real appointment. I just had a minor annoyance that I wanted to get fixed right away before it turned into a bigger problem. But I just got so steamed, even though I saw that my anger was irrational. Sometimes I just get caught up in compulsions, in habits, in familiar tracks of outrage that don't serve me. So I'm watching American Sports Story, the Aaron Hernandez story, and the show is great, except it's produced by Ryan Murphy, and as with pretty much every other Ryan Murphy show that I've watched, it is just continually pounding the theme that the protagonist is just dying to have gay sex, and it's only this cruel and bigoted society that is denying the protagonist the gay sex that would make him a complete human being. And I find it incredibly obnoxious that I'm heterosexual. I don't enjoy getting propagandized for the gay experience of life almost every time I watch a Ryan Murphy show. So I knew that the Aaron Hernandez show would annoy me. And so I also know that I just need to get up and just fast forward through the gay bits. So to take the edge off, I finished my evening with Bad Monkey. It's just a really fun, entertaining show on Apple Plus, based on a Carl Hiaasen novel. I've read probably 6-8 Carl Hiaasen novels. They're just so much fun about bad guys and good guys in ridiculous situations in Florida. They are funny, right? They're lowbrow, but they're just fun and satisfying. So if you move to Florida, want to learn about your new state in an entertaining way, watch Bad Monkey. Vince Vaughn is a terrific actor. And read or listen to Carl Hiaasen novels. Right, so far we haven't gotten the outrageous campus anti-Israel protests that we've been expecting. So surely they're going to ramp up by and around October 7. So far, however, things are pretty chill. Gadi Taub made an interesting point in his Israel Update show with Michael Duran, and that is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, all right, is set on killing members of Hamas, members of terror groups who killed Israelis on October 7. But they only want to arrest Palestinian civilians who participated in the slaughters and the rapes, who aren't known members of known terrorist groups. Right? That's crazy. Right? This is the result of a ruling by Israel's Attorney General that unless you're going after someone who's a known member of a terrorist group, you can only arrest them. Right? You had someone who participated in the slaughter of Israelis on October 7, and just because they're not a known member of a terrorist group, therefore you're not trying to kill them, you only want to arrest them. And Israel doesn't have a death penalty, which is also crazy. Right? Israel should be executing everyone it captures who participated in terror attacks. Israel needs to grow up and start executing people who commit murder. And I'd like to think, as part of Israel's right-wing political shift, that they're going to consider bringing back the death penalty, but they probably won't until there's substantial judicial reform. Right now, right, the Israeli judicial system essentially appoints itself and has seized for itself the right to declare any action taken by the government as legitimate or illegitimate. So based on its own feelings, its own hero system, right, it invalidates much of government policy. No one elected the judges that rule so much of Israel. So I'm completely behind reforming Israel's judicial system to stop allowing these unelected judges such exorbitant power. I'm fine with unelected judges having moderate levels of power, such as in the United States. But in Israel, the amount of power that these judges have is just out of control. It handicaps the IDF's ability to defend Israel. Interesting how effective the IDF has been against Hezbollah. Contrast that with its inept response to the Hamas attacks on October 7. So Rabbi Joseph Telushkin made a great point that he tries to inculcate in himself the prayer that every time he hears an ambulance go by, instead of getting annoyed at the noise, he says a prayer that I hope the ambulance reaches the hospital on time and that the people inside are okay. So that kind of pro-social, hope other people are okay, right? That doesn't come from someone who's broken and twisted up inside and hates himself. Right? How you regard yourself is essentially the same way that you relate to other people. You often hear rhetoric about how so-and-so great leader was tough on himself but gentle on other people. But it never works out that way. People tend to treat other people the same way they relate to themselves. So one great point made with regard to Israel's success against Hezbollah and lack of success defending itself from Hamas is that Israel functions much better on an offense than on defense. And so any nation with neighbors, right, on their borders is going to be vulnerable to invasion. So until recently, I was just annoyed at the ineptitude of the IDF response to the Hamas attacks. Then I realized every nation with neighbors on their borders is vulnerable to attack. The only strong way that you deter invasions is by so severely punishing your attackers that they realize not to do it again, and that you provide an incentive to limit people from attacking you because you'll go after them. Just as the Bar-Ilan professor said, the only way you can stop terrorists is by retaliating directly against their female family members. So the world is much more collective than people in the United States and in the West like to think. Oh, so here's a media trope I find annoying. So I just barely glanced at the headline and the cut line for an article in the Atlantic, but it was something about how some couple or some doctor in Ukraine challenges the West. Here's what challenges the West, right? Building up and increasing its social cohesion and social trust. That challenges the West. And deterring its enemies. And building up its economic and military capabilities, right? So any weakness in those areas, that challenges the West, right? Some rando in Ukraine or the Congo or in Gaza does not challenge the West, right? The purpose of the United States and of the West is not to live up to its highest ideals, right? It is to provide safety, peace, and prosperity for its citizens and for their progeny. I was happy to read cutting criticism of David Samuel's essay in Tablet magazine that so fired me up. I did a 2.5-hour show about it Wednesday night. The upshot of the David Samuel's essay was asking if Tucker Carlson's a Fed, and it advanced all sorts of ridiculous conspiracy theories, such as that Fox News settled its lawsuit with Dominion for nearly $1 billion, not because there was anything in the facts of the lawsuit that would predispose Fox to settle, but because Fox didn't want to get sued and shut down by the federal government. So I can't think of any examples where the federal government has sued and shut down a major American broadcaster or a major American newspaper. It doesn't happen. It was just completely ludicrous. David Samuel's conspiracy theory-laden essay that made no sense. And thank God there was a column in Mediaite noting that Sebastian Gorka was echoing its talking points, and Sebastian Gorka was asking if Tucker Carlson's a Fed. And this was linked from the Drudge Report. And the whole basis of Sebastian Gorka's allegations was this ridiculous David Samuel's essay in Tablet magazine about Tucker Carlson and Fox News and advancing ridiculous conspiracy theories about how Barack Obama still runs the Democratic Party. And this Mediaite essay made clear what a mess the David Samuel's essay was. So I was outraged by the David Samuel's essay because he's such a prestigious writer. So maybe I'm open to the idea that maybe all along David Samuel's is just some vastly overhyped, nonsensical writer who does not deserve the prestige and status that he has attained. because his reasoning seems very similar to reasoning from people in the humanities, where they don't feel bound to the normal rules of facts and logic, but they just free associate. So David Samuel's essay was just one bizarre series of free associations with the occasional thoughtful, provocative, interesting, and possibly valuable point. And yesterday I did a search for reactions to the David Samuels piece, and all of them were talking about how David Samuels is the greatest journalist in America, what a brilliant piece it was, what a hilarious, ironic take David Samuels offers up. So the only perspectives that I could find on the essay, aside from my own, were all filled with praise. But luckily Mediaite now has pointed out how ridiculous and illogical the David Samuels essay was. So Israel has been preparing for war with Hezbollah intensively for at least 18 years, since its very disappointing draw with Hezbollah in 2006. And so when you see Israel's stunning success against Hezbollah, and you contrast it with its inept response to the Hamas attack, you might wonder what the heck's going on. But Israel had a conception that Hamas was not interested in invading Israel, which was not an accurate conception. And Israel had a conception that Hezbollah was determined to have the power to wreak vast amounts of damage to Israel, which is accurate. And so with one opponent, Israel got its conception right, and then with Hezbollah got it right, and with Hamas it got it wrong. So that's the importance of a worldview, right? The more sophisticated and closer to reality you can anchor your understanding of how the world works and how you as an individual work, right, the better off you are. Now, hours and hours of time spent trying to figure out why your ex dumped you and why your ex thought and felt the way that she did, right? That's probably not a productive use of your time. But Israel has Hezbollah's number so far. They planned this and they carried it out in stunning fashion. So what's most likely to reduce killing in the Middle East? Is it some peace deal, or is it Israel's total decimation of its enemies? And I am not wedded to either result, but I am wedded to arguing it's not automatically clear that a peace deal is just inherently superior to all other alternatives. Right? Sometimes when you have peoples in a small geographic area with incompatible goals, the only way you're going to have peace is when there's been a decisive war fought. So what ended Nazi Germany or the World War II Japanese regime is when they were smashed and obliterated. Right? And smashing and obliterating the Nazi regime and the World War II Japanese regime was the most effective way of bringing peace. Right? Probably far more effective than reaching some deal with Hitler in 1943 or 44. So, on the face of it, it seems to me that the easiest road to some kind of reduction in slaughter in the Middle East is for one side to make decisive victories. Now, why do Trump and Harris have opposite agendas for the Ukraine war and the Israel war? So, Trump is a nationalist and a realist. Kamala Harris is a liberal globalist. And so she supports American intervention in Ukraine for reasons that have virtually nothing to do with America's self-interest, but are almost entirely related to globalist, liberal, humanitarian values. Right? Donald Trump is not primarily motivated by globalist, liberal, humanitarian values. He's a nationalist and a realist. And so he recognizes that the hundreds of billions of dollars that we've poured into Ukraine are a waste, that there's no way that Ukraine can win its war with Russia. And it would be better just to have some kind of solution that stops the killing. Now, with regard to Israel, the Biden administration, basically since October 7, has wanted to de-escalate. Since the Hamas attacks that killed 1,200 Israelis and saw over 200 of them taken hostage, right? The consistent, strongest message from the Biden administration was for Israel to de-escalate, to not invade Gaza, to not invade Rafah. The Biden administration did everything they could to slow Israel down and deter Israel from going into Gaza, going all through Gaza, going into Rafah, fighting Hamas on the ground, limiting Israel's battle against those who want to slaughter as many Israelis as possible. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't the Biden administration just cut off arms sales to Israel? And I don't think that's politically tenable, given the power of the Israel lobby. I don't think the Biden administration ever had that capability. So, given the limitations within which it was working, right, the Biden administration has done everything it can to deter Israel's forceful attacks on its enemies. Now, Trump wants to give Israel free rein to defend itself, but wants to wrap up the war with Ukraine and Russia. So why does Israel and Trump, right, align one way, but Ukraine and Trump align a different way? And that's because Israel is the strongest military force in the Middle East. Right? Israel overwhelmingly has the strongest military in the Middle East. And so Israel has the capability of wiping out its enemies who seek to slaughter it if America simply allows Israel to buy the weapons that it needs. On the other hand, Ukraine has no capability on the battlefield of defeating Russia. So from a realist perspective, the opposite approaches by Trump to the Russia-Ukraine and the Israel and its enemies wars makes absolute sense. Israel's got the strongest military. If you simply get off Israel's back, it will do what it needs to do to deter Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran from fomenting war and terror in the Middle East. On the other hand, Ukraine, no matter how much military aid and financial aid you give it, is simply not capable of militarily defeating Russia on the battlefield. So when Ukraine is simply not capable of defeating Russia on the battlefield, it makes sense to push them into some kind of settlement. Right? They're in an unwinnable war. Israel is winning its war. Right? Israel is crushing Hamas. It will strategically withdraw from parts of Gaza. Hamas will pop back up. And then Israel will move back in and slaughter hundreds and thousands of Hamas fighters, withdraw, allow Hamas to re-emerge, then go back in and slaughter them again. And we have numerous reports that Israel has significantly damaged Hezbollah's abilities to attack Israel and to foment terrorism. So So from facts on the ground as we see them right now, looks like Israel's having a great deal of success fighting back against its enemies. So you see a lot of security here at UCLA, right, as we wait for violent riots against Israel. So you don't normally see this amount of security on campus. So there are about probably 40 security guards out and about campus you normally would not see. So this is in preparation for the pro-Palestine, pro-Hezbollah, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel riots that are expected. And my view on how college should respond to riots is the same as how a business should respond to riots, that you don't allow them to disrupt the purpose of your institution. So no one is limiting people who want to make an anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah case, but you don't get to take over buildings. You don't get to limit access to campus facilities to those who have a different political point of view from you or are of a different ethnicity or religion. And that's what happened in the spring when the anti-Israel forces would take over, and then they limit the ability of so-called Zionists to move freely on campus. So as soon as there are any disruption to the ability of people to move freely on campus and to use campus facilities by protesters, then that's the time that you move in and arrest them. And I think the University of California system, of which UCLA is its jewel, have learned their lesson. So normally it's such a chill, professional study vibe here at UCLA. Right, you don't have the seething anger that you frequently see on parts of public transport or on the streets of some of the more vibrant parts of Los Angeles. Right. Student body is composed of the top 2% of high school and community college students. Don't have any written notes with me. I'm just ransacking my mind for all the points that I've been dying to make over the past 36 hours. So 3 months ago, you'd say that the biggest threats to Israel were Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And right now, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, they are back on their heels. They don't seem to be posing much of a threat. I don't think Hamas has been launching any rockets into Israel. Hezbollah's rocket attacks have been sorely limited. And Iran is saying, no mas, let's negotiate. And the Arab world naturally inclines towards siding with the strong horse. And Israel, day in and day out, proving itself the strong horse. So I went to UCLA in 1988-89, studied economics here. And about the only difference in the look of UCLA students is there appears to be less affirmative action now than back then, and cell phones. But aside from that, I couldn't really tell any significant sartorial differences. Oh, and our football team was a lot better. When we had Troy Aikman here, we were the number one team in the nation for 2 or 3 weeks back in the fall of 1988. Now UCLA's basketball team is probably going to be ranked top 5 this year. So why do men love sports? Right? It's rooted in our testosterone, our desire to compete, in our tribalist feelings, and in its rehearsal for war. Right? Sports are essentially a rehearsal for war. The type of discipline and teamwork and hierarchical control that you need to effectively wage war, you see exemplified in a successful sports team, where you have an organization, general manager, a coach, who try to break things down and make them as simple as possible for the players who will be carrying out the designs of the high IQ coach and general manager. And war works a similar way. So in the liberal worldview, you get peace when you expand human freedom, right? It's the George W. Bush second term agenda. Just expand liberal democracy, expand human rights around the world, and that's the most likely way to get peace. And I'm skeptical of that. Right? Sometimes the best way to get peace is to strongly incentivize those who wish to disrupt peace to not do so. If they do so, you kill them or you put them in prison for life. Sometimes nation states operate better as xenophobic police states, right? There are situations where you want your state to be a xenophobic police state because under certain situations of grave peril, the xenophobic police state is the one that's most adaptive to your survival and thriving and prosperity and safety. And then in other situations, particularly when you're an island, right, you can be much more open to trade, to integrating some number of outsiders, to a more democratic and liberal system. Liberal democracy is great for populations where you have an average IQ over 92. And sometimes it's still the best system for states where you have an average IQ of 82, such as India. The average IQ in India is about 82. And they have a working democracy there. But when Egypt got democracy, right, the Muslim Brotherhood rose to power. So it was better to have an autocratic military rule for Egypt than to have democratic rule. When Gaza was accorded democracy, it elected Hamas. So democracy and liberal democracy are not automatically the best ways of politically organizing a nation state. And it's certainly not the duty of America to go around the world trying to create regimes of liberal democracy through military force or economic sanction. We want to align with other nations based primarily on our own interests. And that will frequently mean taking the side of autocracies against democracies. Okay, comment in the chat, England's and Anglos are way too individualistic. Well, it seemed to be a good strategy, right, until the 1960s, right? So an individualist Anglo society works out pretty well for an overwhelmingly Anglo society, but it doesn't work out as well when you import people who have a dual morality, right? Where they operate with one morality with regard to their in-group and a different morality with regard to out-groups. Doesn't work too well when you have to compete against those who use a group strategy as opposed to the individualist strategy. So I remember serving on a jury where the jurors had determined that even though the evidence was overwhelming that the black defendant was guilty of sin, they thought there were too many black men in jail already, and so they voted to acquit simply because the guy was black. All right, obviously the Anglo-Saxon trial by jury system doesn't work when you have those kind of group identities that overwhelm any commitment to truth and justice. So Peter Dutton is the leader of Australia's Conservative opposition, and his stand is that Australia should take 0 Palestinian refugees. Now, isn't that bigoted and racist? I am sure that there are some Palestinian refugees who would be a blessing to Australia, but why take the risk? Right? When you see the dislocation caused by Palestinians wherever they go in the world, by Muslim refugees, what they've created in England and France, Germany, Europe, and why would anyone want to take the risk in importing that at this particular time and place? I don't think that there's any unchangeable essential quality to Islam or to being a Muslim, right? Islam, Islamic identity will reflect itself differently in different times and places. So the Islam that's practiced in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia is quite different from the Islam that's practiced in South Asia. Right? Islamic terrorists generally don't tend to come from Thailand and other Asian communities in South Asia. Right? They tend to come from particular Islamic countries, which is why the Trump Muslim ban is really a ban against Muslim immigrants from just, I think, approximately 7 countries. So right now, at this particular time and place, Palestinians have shown themselves prone to terrorism and to disrupting societies that they move to. And so I think Peter Dutton makes a good case that there's no need for Australia to risk its safety and security by bringing in Palestinian refugees, but at a different time and place, right? Admitting Palestinian refugees might be a wonderful and wise and economical and prosperous and pro-social thing to do, but not right now. So all the usual suspects in the media and in polite society are condemning Peter Dutton for racism and bigotry because he doesn't want Australia to accept any Palestinian refugees. I think to your average Australian that sounds pretty smart. And Peter Dutton's also campaigned on an issue of bringing nuclear power. So Australia's never had nuclear power, and he wants a massive commitment to nuclear power as a key part of his economic and energy strategy. And most of the experts have condemned his move, saying we should rely on renewable sources, green energy. So one thing that Peter Dutton is not is a milquetoast. He's not just some kind of middle-of-the-road, easygoing alternative to the rather centrist Labour government that's currently in power. Right? Peter Dutton is a former policeman from Queensland, which is Australia's most conservative state. And he's taking strong, controversial stands that buck the elite news media consensus on issues. I think Jim Goad said that Australians have the most woke media while Australians as a people are about the most racist white people in the world. So there's much less piety in Australia. There's far more fear in America, and the fear spurs innovation, and it spurs people to work hard. Right? Americans work many more hours than Australians. Right? American workers have far fewer rights than Australians. But the litigiousness of American society and the kind of the German-style piety and speech codes of American society make life much more frightening for your average American than for your average Australian. So Australians are naturally irreverent. They naturally have distrust and skepticism of authority, while Americans tend to have a more reverential treatment of the president. It's the president. He represents us all and of authority. So people get fired a lot more easily in the United States. It's much more challenging to get fired in Australia. There's socialized medicine in Australia, so people aren't worried about losing their health insurance. Now, I have a lot of friends who are dual Australian-American citizens. I know a lot of Australians who've moved to America and love it here. So what I find, generally speaking, is that when we live in America, we may miss Australia and long to go back, at least for a visit. But if we move back to Australia, then we miss America. If we move to America, we miss Australia. Both countries come with strengths and weaknesses. So the word that makes Christians vibrate is love. Right? Christians love the word love. The word that makes Jews vibrate is law or justice. The word that makes Americans tingle is freedom. And the word that makes Australians feel good is fairness. So Australians have about 30 different ways of saying fair. There's fair go, mate. Fair dinkum. She'll be right, mate. Right, so Australians and New Zealanders, right, their number one political value is fairness. And for Americans, it's freedom. Though, of course, the meaning of freedom depends entirely on your hero system. So does not the meaning of fairness depend entirely on your hero system? Well, Australia and New Zealand have had enough homogeneity that the understanding of what it means to be fair has a great deal of coherence. Well, more coherence to what Australians and New Zealanders understand to be fair as opposed to what Americans regard as freedom. Australia should never have abolished the White Australia policy without maintaining their British and European character. They're going to be colonized by India and China. Doesn't Australia have laws against hate speech? Yes, it does. What happens there if you openly criticize mass non-European immigration in Australia? So it depends on how you do it and what your position is. So if you're a member of the elite, if you're a professor of law, TV commentator, a CEO, right, you're the leader of some organization, right, the more elite your status, the more difficult it is to say that. But if you're just a regular Australian plumber and you're just saying this with your mates, you're usually not going to get into too much trouble. So there is a more relaxed feeling about life in Australia, even though Australia has more restrictive hate speech laws than does America. So speaking strictly on First Amendment terms, speaking strictly on free speech issues, then yeah, the United States has more freedom than Australia. There was an interesting discussion on Mark Halperin's show this morning. If Kamala Harris is elected president of the United States, what does she do well? And Halperin has known Kamala Harris for a long time, since before she was a US Senator. And so, trying to remember, what was it? She's not good at interviews, all right? She's not good at speaking spontaneously, but she can give a prepared speech. And she's not good at running things. She's not good at building up camaraderie in her team, but she is good at Kamala Harris, the diversity, equity, inclusion candidate. Right? She hasn't faced the normal test that a politician in her position would face, but she's been operating in California, which is a one-party state. And she got into politics for being Willie Brown's mistress. It's interesting that Kamala Harris's start in politics as Willie Brown's mistress hasn't received more attention. She is good at understanding what her donors want, who her most important donors are. She's close with Steve Jobs' widow. And so she is good at carrying out the policies wished for by her donors. And she's good at staying connected to her donors, not disappointing her donors. She's extremely loath to make decisions that could alienate somebody. So she's very wishy-washy and indecisive. But Mark Halperin said that she's a capable politician. Now, when are we going to hear about major Kamala Harris scandals? So the ideal time for leaking them would be 1 week to 2 weeks before the election. But then a large number of Americans are going to vote early. And so voting has already started. And so you'd think that if you've got some major Kamala Harris scandal, you'd want to leak it now. J.D. Vance and Tim Walz are going to debate next Tuesday. And they've both shown themselves to be quite capable on the campaign trail. J.D. Vance has the most unpopular ratings for any vice presidential candidate in memory. So I would expect that a debate with Tim Walz can only serve him. Like, he can only improve. So there's the first major anti-psychotic drug coming to the market now in decades. So I wonder if that will reduce the number of homeless, and if that will give more incentives for forcing mentally ill people to get help. I think it's anti-schizophrenia drug. I think it's the first anti-schizophrenia drug. So a disproportionate amount of the homeless are schizophrenic, and also schizophrenics have an astounding rate of violent crime. So when you encounter someone who's mentally ill, they are more likely to hurt you than a normal person. And schizophrenics in particular have an astronomical rate of violent crime. And so arresting schizophrenic homeless people and mentally ill homeless people and forcing them into treatment, something that I would favor. All right, that screaming, gesticulating schizophrenic on your train, on your bus, on your street is a significant threat to your safety. So the liberal pious view is that these people are mainly a threat to themselves, but that's not accurate, right? They're also a threat to you. There's a reason that we all have this innate tendency to shy away from mentally ill people. Right? We have a sense in our kishkas that they present a significant threat to our safety. If someone's acting and speaking in an antisocial manner, the odds are much higher than average that they'll also act violently in an antisocial manner. So I was sitting on the bus the other day and I looked at the person next to me, white guy, covered with tattoos, including facial tattoos. Right? Getting tattoos on your face is a particularly extreme statement of bad judgment. So I would suspect that a person with face tattoos is much more likely to be a menace than someone without facial tattoos. Right? He also had weird and bizarre piercings. Again, this is a public signal that you make poor choices, that you're not normal, that you're predisposed to really bad decision making, and that you're a menace. Right? When I encounter someone who is dressed properly and politely and conducts and speaks in a proper and polite fashion for the context in which they're in, right? There's a feeling of confident safety that they bring. Right? People who speak and act in a bizarre fashion, right? There's a reason that we shy away and consider them dangerous. One theme running in this story about the damaging effect of concussions on his brain. I think that's one area where life has improved. We have much more appropriate concern about brain health, brain safety, and reducing and minimizing shocks to the brain. So somebody played or linked to a clip of Heather McDonald saying that the values of women inclining towards safety dominated our COVID response. Meaning that in our public health choices that we leaned too much towards safety, and we allowed concerns of safety to outweigh other considerations such as freedom and prosperity and our need to be social with other people. So my position is, according to the studies that I've seen, overall our response to COVID was better than could be expected, that overall our public health, our politicians, our elites did a better than average job, and that generally speaking, social distancing was more beneficial than negative, and that getting vaccinated is more beneficial than negative. And overall, following public health advice with regard to COVID, overall is more beneficial than defying it, even though a significant portion of that advice was wrong, but overall it was right. And so in response to that, I noticed from people who are otherwise broadly sympathetic to things I talk about, they will send me statements by this person or that person rebutting me. But I don't care about clips of Heather McDonald or any thinker that I respect giving a 60-second or a 2-hour opinion on our COVID response. What I would need to see to change my mind are meta-analyses, right? A meta-analysis is where you take most or all the studies done on a particular topic. In this case, it's public health responses to COVID. So you take all the studies done on the topic and you appropriately weight them. So some studies are more serious than other studies. And by using a meta-analysis, you combine them all, appropriately weighting the more serious studies with greater weight than the more frivolous studies. And through the meta-analysis, you get clarity on what studies overall show with regard to the question at issue. So for the populist right-wing types in my life, both online and offline, rebel against COVID restrictions, they never think in terms of meta-analyses, right? They think in terms of this anecdote and that anecdote. And I just don't find that persuasive epistemics. Epistemology is how do we know what we know, right? How do we know what we know about COVID and appropriate response, right? From the knowledge that has been generated by studies and that have been appropriately weighted and analyzed and combined with all other studies on the topic. And so linking to this social media post and this public pronouncement and this column, right, is not a serious way of trying to assess the validity or the error of this or that public health response to COVID, right? The serious way to discuss this topic is by linking to noting a meta-analysis where you combine and appropriately weight all studies on a topic. But that requires effort. And just linking to anecdotes to support your point of view, right, doesn't require any effort. It just comes naturally. People just want to do the easy thing and find social media posts that conform to their worldview. They don't have to challenge themselves. So I heard Matt Welch on a Reason Magazine podcast state definitively, this is about 2 weeks ago, I think about 35 minutes in, that all groups inevitably assimilate just as the Irish and the Italians have. And it's a type of embarrassing nonsense, the humiliating idiocy that you have to spew, it seems, to have a seat at the table in the prestige media, because overwhelmingly groups do not assimilate except in the most superficial of ways, right? You have people from Africa being in the United States for 400 years and still haven't come close to assimilating. You know, they still have violent crime rates that are astronomical, low educational attainment, low income attainment, welfare dependency problems, out of wedlock birth problems. So if 400 years of Africans in America haven't assimilated, then how on earth can you state conclusively that, oh, every group just assimilates, right? Fourth generation, fifth generation Mexican Americans aren't more successful with income and education than, say, first and second generation Mexican Americans. So by and large, assimilation is a myth. People tend to assimilate only in the most superficial of ways, such as dress and language. But their life histories will still correlate with their ancestors.